Dear students, I welcome you to this lecture. It is all about operant conditioning learning theory given by the famous American psychologist B.F. Skinner, who is a well-known behaviorist, author, inventor and a high-order social philosopher. Calling his approach to the study of behavior as radical behaviorism, he asserted that human free will is an illusion and that any human action is the result of the consequences of the same action. If the consequences are bad, there is a high chance that the action will not be repeated. However, if the consequences are good, the actions that led to it become more probable. Unlike cognitive scientists and less rigid behaviorists, B.F. Skinner, as a radical behaviorist, does not accept private events such as thinking, perception, and unobservable emotions as causes of an organism's behavior. For Skinner, the terms referring to mental states, for example, drive, belief, intent, these are the vague terms, ambiguous and unnecessary to the understanding of behavior. For him, the inner workings of the mind and the body were a black box, inaccessible to direct observation. This point of view was shared by all behaviorists, but Skinner went further, arguing that even if thoughts and even other mental states could be studied, they would have no real value in explaining behavior. Instead, the environment in which a response occurs, the response itself and the response consequences are all that are necessary to understand behavior. By insisting that mental states are both inaccessible to study and irrelevant to understanding behavior, Skinner was advocating a point of view which has come to be called radical behaviorism. Skinner coined the term operant conditioning, replacing Thorndike's instrumental conditioning and renaming classical conditioning as respondent conditioning. Skinner used the term operant to refer to any active behavior that operates upon the environment to generate consequences. Skinner referred to emitted behaviors as operant responses, which are contingent upon or depend upon a response emitted by the organism. The study of the response elicited by classical conditioning is less important complex behavior than the study of responses which are not reflexively or mechanically evoked. Skinner held that the later response is evoked by operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is defined as the use of consequences to modify the occurrence and form of behavior. To put it simply, behavior that is followed by pleasant consequences tends to be repeated and thus learned. Behavior that is followed by unpleasant consequences tends not to be repeated and thus not learned. Operant conditioning by B.F. Skinner was developed by him at Harvard University in 1938 and has been considered to be a popular approach for influencing behavior. Although the model was originally applied to animal learning, like rats and pigeons, it was later commonly applied in educational settings. The model involves the operations of positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, shaping, generalization, extinction, etc. It was at Harvard that Skinner became interested in studying human behavior in an objective and scientific way. He developed what he referred to as an operant conditioning apparatus, which later became known as Skinner box or Skinner chamber. The device was a chamber that contained a bar or key that an animal could press in order to receive food, water, or some other forms of reinforcement. He also invented the cumulative recorder, a device that recorded responses as a slowed line. The device also allowed Skinner to see that the schedule of reinforcement that was used also influenced the rate of response. Using the device, he found that behavior did not depend on the preceding stimulus as Watson and Pavlov maintained. Instead of this, Skinner found that behaviors were dependent upon what happened after the response. As he maintained, the consequences of behavior determine the probability that the behavior will occur again. The most essential feature of operant conditioning is that it can be made more likely or more appropriate by the use of reinforcement. The response is therefore changed according to need and demand of the individual. The response is made and determined by the organism itself. This is the most distinguished feature of operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is not as simple as classical conditioning. Here, not only simple new connections are learned, but variability in behavior emerges, which is different from the original response. For instance, using the instrumental conditioning technique, Lashley has indicated that a monkey who has been conditioned to open the puzzle box with one of its paws on another occasion uses the other paw if it is prevented to use the first paw. This indicates that the animal is capable of making varied types of responses according to the demand of the environment. Now, dear students, let us go through the mechanism of operant conditioning. First of all, we would like to see what reinforcement in learning means. Thorndike, Pavlov, Skinner, and Hull, all the prominent learning psychologists have emphasized the role of reinforcement in learning. It is a basic requirement, a necessary condition in learning. Reinforcement is used to strengthen the SR connection, that is the stimulus response connection, and increase the probability of learning a task. Skinner views that reinforcement can be manipulated to control the speed and strength of a response, including its occurrence and non-occurrence. Reinforcement refers to the process whereby the delivery of a stimulus increases the probability of behavior. Reinforcement can be done by giving an appetitive stimulus, or we may call it positive reinforcement, or by the removal of an aversive stimulus, or negative reinforcement as it is often called. In other words, there may be either a positive or a negative contingency between the behavior and reinforcement. A positive contingency means that something is given. For example, bar pressing is followed by food. A negative contingency means that something is taken away. For example, bar pressing terminates or prevents shock. The presentation of a positive reinforcement increases the frequency of the behavioral response. For example, if studying is followed by a high grade on an exam, then the incidence of studying before exams will increase. On the other hand, negative reinforcement is the removal of an unpleasant or aversive stimulus following a behavioral response. Presentation of this negative reinforcement also increases the frequency of the behavioral response. For example, if leaving a study area removes you from a noisy classmate, then the time you spend away from the study area will automatically increase. Punishment is the converse of reinforcement. It decreases the probability of a behavior and consists of the delivery of an aversive stimulus, or you may call it positive punishment or simply punishment, or in another case it is the removal of an appetitive stimulus and you may call it negative punishment or omission training. There may be either a positive contingency between the behavior and punishment. For example, bar pressing is followed by shock, or negative contingency. For example, bar pressing terminates or prevents food delivery. Presentation of positive punishment decreases the frequency of the behavioral response. If your professor embraces you asking a question in class, then the likelihood you will ask questions in class will decrease. The presentation of the negative punishment too decreases the frequency of the behavioral response. For example, if your friend withholds affection whenever you watch TV, the time you spend in front of the TV will decrease. Now, schedules of reinforcement. In real life, not every instance of behavior is reinforced. In most of life's experiences, what we see, we are not reinforced every time we make the response. For example, a smile may not evoke a smile in the others always. A footballer does not win every tournament he enters into. A student is not patted at the back every time he receives grade A. In many real life instances, reinforcement comes on and goes off unpredictably. In many other instances, reinforcements are delivered according to rules. We receive salaries every month and the new vehicles receive free services according to rules. How do these rules, known as schedules of reinforcing, affect behavior? The reinforcement may be continuous, in which every occurrence of behavior is reinforced. This simplest form of reinforcement delivery is termed as a continuous reinforcement schedule. If a rat receives a foot fillet every time it presses the lever, it is a continuous reinforcement schedule. Other type of reinforcement schedule is called partial reinforcement schedule. In partial reinforcement, response is not rewarded every time it occurs. This schedule is more important in maintaining learned behaviors. Once a response is learned under partial reinforcement schedule, it takes longer to be extinguished. Extinction of pecking in pigeons reinforced every 5 minutes takes days, whereas in case of pigeons reinforced continuously, extinguish in a matter of minutes. Now let us take another type of reinforcement schedule known as intermittent schedule. These schedules are called ratio schedules because reinforcement depends on the number of responses the organism makes. The ratio can be either fixed or variable. In fixed ratio reinforcement schedule, the reinforcement is given after a fixed number of responses. A rat, for example, may be given a pellet of food after a certain number of lever presses. A student may be properly rewarded after he answers a fixed number of questions, for example, say 3 or 5. The fixed ratio schedule is used in some factories or by employees of casual workers or laborers where wages are paid on a piecework basis, that is, the number of garments sewn or the number of baskets packed. On a variable ratio schedule, reinforcement is provided after a certain number of responses, with the number varying unpredictably. Here, reinforcement is intermittent or irregular. Other schedules of reinforcement are called interval schedules because in the plan of scheduling, temporal intervals in place of number of trials is planned for the delivery of reinforcement. In a fixed interval reinforcement schedule, the organism is rewarded for a response is made only after a set interval of time, for example, every 3 or 5 minutes. How many times he has given correct responses during the fixed interval of time does not matter. On a variable interval schedule, reinforcement still depends on a certain interval having elapsed, but the interval's duration varies unpredictably. For an example of a variable interval schedule in everyday life, just consider redialing a phone number after hearing a busy signal. To receive reinforcement means getting your call through. You have to wait some time interval after your last response, that is dialing, but the length of that interval is unpredictable. Now take in another process, shaping. Shaping is the most important mechanism used in operant conditioning. It refers to the judicious use of selective reinforcement to bring desirable changes in the behavior of the organism. It is a technique to shape the complex behavior by systematically reinforcing closer approximation to the desired behavior. Shaping is based on the principle that a little learning can lead to final mastery. In shaping, each small step the organism makes to reach the goal is reinforced, rather than only the final response. This is done by the method of successive approximations. At first, actions that are faintly similar to the target behavior are reinforced. The organism learns to show the responses that closely approximate the target behavior. In this way, shaping involves constructing a complex behavior by the method of successive approximation. Shaping is a classic concept in instrumental and operant conditioning. Reinforce the steps leading to the desired response, and that response will eventually occur. This is what Brown and Jenkins said. The principle of shaping is general one which applies to the instrumental learning of humans as well as lower animals. Our many attitudes, beliefs, customs, learned goals and certain aspects of language use, etc. are the results of shaping by means of reinforcement. Just take an example from the human behavior. Suppose we want to train a child for toilet training. Simply putting a child on the toilet is not successful, because as soon as the child is placed on the stool, what happens? He begins to cry. It has been reported by psychologists that toilet training behavior may be shaped within a fortnight. What mothers do? Mothers use the shaping technique like entertaining the child and giving chocolates, which follows by successful elimination. To reach a complex sequence of behaviors, shaping is combined with chaining. Chaining refers to the process in the shaping of behavior and the learning of a task, where the required behavior or a task is broken down into small steps for its effective learning and subsequent reinforcement. Each small step, or we may call it a segment, each segment in the chain must be linked with the succeeding segment. Here, cues produced by one response are linked with the next response. It is a sort of chain reaction where one object sparks the other object in its proximity, and that in turn causes sparking in the next object in the chain, and so on. In behavioral terms, chaining starts when one response brings the organism into contact with stimulus that both reward the last response and cause the next response. That response in turn causes the organism to experience stimulus that both reward the response and cause the next response. The starting of conversation between people is an example of chain behavior. When we meet someone we know, it is an effective stimulus for starting chain experiences. We greet him and he greets in response. For example, shaking hands or receiving with outstretched arms. And in the way, one generated response gives birth to another response, and so on. That is behavior which consists of chain response. Here, shaping and chaining have important implications for human behavior. Animal trainers use both shaping and chaining to teach complex chain of behavior to animals. Dear students, now let us go through other processes like extinction, generalization and discrimination. As with classical conditioning, the operant response also undergoes extinction when reinforcement no longer follows the response. If reinforcement is no longer given after the rat has learned the lever pressing response, the tendency to press the lever gradually weakens. Over a period of time, the response extinguishes and is not shown. Following a rest period after extinction, spontaneous recovery takes place. Generalization. Generalization refers to the ability of an organism dealing with the perception of and response to similar stimulus. Once the response is acquired to a particular stimulus, the organism shows a similar response to a similar stimulus. Pigeons were reinforced for pecking at a disc of a particular color. These pigeons also pecked at the discs close in color to the original disc. This phenomena is known as generalization. A child demonstrates the ability when he successfully subtracts 4 apples from 9 apples after learning to subtract 4 oranges from 9 oranges. In this way, generalization may be understood in terms of learning process where the organism learns to provide similar operant responses to stimulus similar to but not the same as the training stimulus. In helping the children to learn appropriate generalization, due care should be taken by the parents and teachers to reinforce the behavior of the children only after they demonstrate the ability to generalize correctly. Overgeneralization like calling all 4-legged animals as cows should be immediately discouraged, and they should be helped to learn correct generalization and discrimination for acquiring the proper concept of things and events surrounding them. Discrimination. Discrimination is the process of learning to make one response to one stimulus and another response, or no response to another stimulus. Discrimination is achieved simply by reinforcing a particular response to one stimulus and not reinforcing to another, which amounts to extinguishing the same response to another stimulus. In Skinner's box, the animal learns to press the lever when the light is on and not when the light is off. Thus, light becomes the cue or signal for the operant behavior, that is, the lever press response. Equipped with this learned signal, the animal picks up the ability to discriminate between stimuli for emitting the learned response. In other words, the animal develops a discriminative operant, which is an operant response extended to one set of circumstances but not to another. People and other animals readily learn to pay attention to cues in the environment that reliably signal certain consequences for their actions. Dear students, let us conclude here by emphasizing on the fact that B.F. Sickner, as one of the leading exponents of behaviorism, maintained that learning is a result of any change in overt and observable behavior. Sickner believed that the only scientific approach to psychology was one that studied behaviors, not internal, subjective mental processes. When a desired stimulus response pattern is reinforced, the individual is conditioned to respond in a certain way and learning takes place. Reinforcement, as a vital element in Sickner's stimulus response theory, is anything that strengthens a desired response, such as verbal praise or a good grade. Schedules of reinforcement are used to establish and maintain behavior. Different types of reinforcement, like positive and negative, and schedules of reinforcement do have an effect on behavior regarding acquisition, rate of responding, and extinction rates. Thank you, my dear students.